And there we go. So it's actually just automatically recording, just so you know. Hi, folks. Welcome today. We'll just get started in a couple minutes as people are still filtering in through the waiting. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us today for Our Lives, Our Stories, Authentic 2SLGBTQ+ media representation. We'll have a brief presentation and a discussion on telling 2SLGBTQ+ stories in the media and what representation means for our communities. Today's discussion will be approximately 60 minutes and will be recorded and posted on the 519's YouTube channel. My name is Megan Poole and I'm the Manager of Community Relations at the 519. My job today is to help guide our conversation and provide space for our speakers to share their experiences. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land we're on. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on as the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. While we meet today virtually, we must recognize that the land we're on belongs to many different nations, including but not limited to the ones listed today. We must recognize our own diverse histories as they intersect with colonization and take active steps honoring the truth of our country's history, as well as the actions we must take towards reconciliation. Now let's look at what we'll be talking about today. First, we will set the stage and provide a bit of context on the 519's media reference guide, and then we'll jump into a broader discussion with our speakers. I want to take this moment to remind folks that we are here to share and learn, and in that spirit, please be respectful. So we'll be talking about what the 519 media reference guide even is. Why do we need it? How did the 519 and community partners come together to create this guide? And then we'll go into a broad discussion with our panelists, with hopefully some time for questions and final thoughts. Today is International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia. This year's theme is Our Bodies, Our Lives, Our Rights. In honor of this beautiful theme, we at the 519 want to introduce our brand new media reference guide to help better serve our communities as well as support autonomy and self-determination. The 519 has spent months connecting with communities, community partners, and journalists. Created with trans and gender diverse communities in mind, the 519 has compiled best practices and principles to help build trust and produce better journalism alongside our communities. These tips and tools will be available for reference on a microsite to be launched later this month. We have seen an explosion of queer stories on television with sensational shows like Sort of and Heartstopper. We know that this representation is so important to our communities to see themselves reflected in the media. The same is true for reporting in news outlets. We know that good reporting for trans and gender diverse communities means good reporting for all. To see and hear ourselves reflected in the stories we tell allows each individual to feel safer expressing lived experiences and share their wealth of knowledge. Our lives, our stories. Over the years, we have seen trans and gender diverse communities misrepresented in the media, either by dead naming folks, misrepresenting their gender, or a wide variety of microaggressions. Inaccurate, disrespectful, and offensive reporting has done a lot of damage, especially to our marginalized communities. An interview is a particularly vulnerable position for journalist sources. Each person has to trust that they've been heard and seen in an authentic way which best represents them. Being misquoted or misrepresented in the media can make a person feel dehumanized, emotionally vulnerable, and like they haven't been heard. When this trust is lost, our communities disappear and we miss out on a diverse set of experiences, knowledge, and values. We lose another perspective on the world in which we all live, a perspective that can shift thinking and invite more people into important conversations. We miss out on important stories. The next two slides are just some facts to help us lay the groundwork. These facts help us understand that the communities who have historically been shut out of conversations make up a large part of Canadians. Who are we even excluding in the media? There are over 100 million people, there are over 1 million people in Canada who identify as trans or non-binary. Over 4% of people over the age of 15 identify as 2SLGBTQ+ in Canada. That's over 75,000 people. 1 in 3 people in our 2SLGBTQ+ communities are under the age of 25. 68% of trans and non-binary people have reported being verbally harassed in the last 5 years. 9 out of 10 racialized trans and non-binary people anticipate unfair treatment from the police or legal systems. And 41% of trans Canadians have experienced unwanted sexual behavior online, compared to 16% of cisgendered Canadians. Over the past few months, the 519 has met with community partners, stakeholders, journalists, and community members to help shape our media reference guide. These folks shared their stories, experiences, and helped develop tools for best practices. The identities and experiences of community members do not fit neatly into one box or the other. We can all start with an open and honest dialogue. For people of color and racialized people, their experience with the healthcare system has always been challenging, and adding the trans identity to that is just another barrier. Now that's a quote from one of our panelists today, Yasmeen Persad. And so now that we've set up some context here, let's start digging a little deeper. Let's meet our panelists. Yasmeen Persad is the coordinator of the 519's Trans People of Color Project, TPOC, and a Trans Pulse Canada researcher. Additionally, she is the research coordinator for TWIRI, the Trans Women HIV Research Initiative at the Women's College Hospital. Over the past 15 years, she has worked with trans intersectional communities and service providers to create, produce, and allow trans folks to access social services across the province. Yasmeen was instrumental in helping develop the 519's media guide to support journalists, activists, and advocates to better tell 2SLGBTQ+ stories. Next up, we have Rachel Giese, who is an award-winning journalist and author. She is currently a deputy national editor at the Globe and Mail, and prior to that, she was the editorial director of Extra magazine. Her 2018 book, Boys, What It Means to Become a Man, won the Writers' Trust of Canada Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for political writing. Okay, well, now that we've set up some context for why we're here, let's start digging a little deeper. I want to toss it to Yaz first. Yaz, how do you think robust and accurate media representation impacts our trans, non-binary, and two-spirited communities?
Everyone, and welcome. I think that, can you repeat the question?
Of course. So how do you think robust and accurate media representation impacts our trans, non-binary, and two-spirited communities?
Oh, I think there's many parts to it. So I think having media representation that focuses on actual people's lives. So talking, speaking to the truth of folks, speaking to the reality of the experiences that folks, experience, and just really not painting a picture that for most people or for most media tend to, want to. So they want the story, but they also want the story to fit in line with what, they need. So I think showing this media representation and really, making it a level playing field has a lot of moving pieces to it.
Yeah, for sure. When you speak about a level playing field, can you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, I think some of the things that you touched on earlier on, like using people's name and not like their dead name, using, the correct gender identity, pronouns for folks. And if they're not sure, being able to say, okay, ask first before. One of the other pieces also asking to see, what the media is putting out first before they put it out, so we can make sure that the content is accurate. So those are some of the pieces also.
Great, thank you. Now, Rachel, you've worked as a journalist for a very long time now. How has representation for queer communities kind of shifted in your career?
It's shifted a lot. I mean, my career as a journalist began in sort of the mid to late 90s to now. So that spanned a huge arc of a lot of movements for legal recognition and for civil rights for various communities that are part of the two-spirit LGBTQ plus community. I think that in terms of representation, sort of picking up on what Yasmeen was saying is, I think within mainstream media, and by that I mean non-queer media, I think that we're getting to a place where there's more nuance, there's just more period of understanding that the LGBTQ2S+ community is not a monolith. We don't all think the same. Our access to power, our relationship to politics, our worldviews are very different. So I think we're beginning to see, I think we're at the start of that change. I also think that there are more of us, but not nearly enough of us, and not nearly a representative group of us working within mainstream media organizations who I think are also helping to direct some of that change of coverage within. But I think that that's still, I still don't think we have representation at the highest levels, at the sort of the decision-making roles, but certainly there are, more LGBTQ2S+ writers, thinkers, commentators that we're now beginning to see showing up on a panel discussion about an election, or who are, writing stories in publications like mine, like the Globe and Mail. So I think that's the biggest change, is more nuance and more of us telling the stories within the mainstream. And I think that's what I've noticed the most in the sort of the 25 years that I've been working as a journalist.
Yeah, that's amazing. I guess that kind of leads into my next question, is maybe for both Yaz and Rachel. How do you think we can better tell stories from our 2S LGBTQ communities beyond days of importance, like today, International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biphobia, Trans Day of Visibility, Trans Day of Remembrance, or even Pride coming up. Pride Month is coming up, and I know there will be a lot of demands for kind of queer stories. So how can we weave that into more mainstream media and maybe every day?
Well, it opens up a bigger conversation, right? Because we have this experience for so long, only when it's around certain things that relate to 2SLGBT communities, we become saturated with the media or folks wanting, interviews or stuff like that. Or if something harmful happens, then we see the media coming around. However, if the media, were to again, sort of act as a level playing field and talk about these issues, regularly and not just on certain times and dates, I think that will really help people to remember and think about folks, like 2SLGBT folks exist, and this is the realities of their lives. And I think that's one of the pieces that the conversation needs to continue, and it needs to go on and on. One of the other thing too is often the media will ask for a story, and they'll ask today for the story for Friday, which is also something that we're not prepared for most of the time. And that's something that they also need to talk about. And I think especially specific to our communities, I think they feel like we want this media exposure, so we will do it quickly. And that's not the case most of the time.
Rachel, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to jump in?
I know, I feel like I want to take Yasmeen into my newsroom and talk to some of my colleagues. Yeah, I mean, I think to pick up on something that you've just said, I think that we need to definitely move away from only telling trauma stories. And I think this is specifically true for racialized and trans folks in our communities. And it feels like media attention only happens when it's a bad news story, when it's a story about violence and trauma. And, I think we need to remember that, as queer and trans people, we are everywhere doing all the things all the time. We're not just a community that experiences, tragedy and sorrow and grief. And I think, we are embedded in every story, whether that's a story about the Ontario election and where healthcare dollars are going to be allocated, whether it's a story about housing, whether it's simply a story about what people plan to do now that restrictions have lifted with their summer, whether it's telling stories about, community networks of support. So just a recent example of a story that I assigned to one of my reporters, obviously the invasion of Ukraine has been very much front page news. And I was talking to one of my writers whose beat is sexuality and asked her to look at what were the experiences of LGBTQ people in Ukraine, what were those stories? And Ukraine has had some small progress being made in its queer and trans communities. Neighboring countries around Ukraine, where a lot of refugees are going, are very hostile to LGBTQ people. So the story really centered the voices of a lot of activists on the ground there, and talking about how they were supporting their communities within Ukraine and also working with people who were looking to leave. And so, there was a story of a trans man who is a doctor who's been working to ensure that there's access to hormone therapy because that was one of the things that was being cut off. There were also real concerns about queer families being separated when they went to shelters that they might experience. So, this story was locating people in our communities within a bigger story. And I think that that's true of any story we tell is we know we're there. And so I think it's reminding people that we exist in every story and should be included when we tell all of the stories, whether that's about Canada or the world or whatever it is.
Absolutely. That sounds like a fascinating story. Has that come out yet?
It has. It came out about a month ago. So if you just if you Google search Globe and Mail LGBT Ukraine, you'll be able to find the story.
Amazing. Yes, since Rachel shared one of her stories about kind of how to better include 2SLGBTQ communities in reporting, do you have an example of like maybe a recent article that you saw that was like exemplary in its coverage?
I haven't seen anything like recently, except for like the you know, the little snippets that leading up to Pride. I just think that also just to add on, and when we start talking about the stories, is also like who's in the position to tell the story. So it's most of the time it's like the privileged folks who get the request. Like, you know, for example, like I get a lot of media requests, but I feel like I don't need to tell that story or to tell the story all the time. And really, again, thinking about when you're telling the story, we're talking about a story from the intersectionality of how folks, you know, represent themselves, and that is something we need to be cautious about when, you know, the way the media presents it. I'm just thinking what I saw. The only thing I saw recently was with Stats Canada. It was what they were talking about how trans and non-binary folks were able to get they were able to capture the demographics of them. So that was something which in line was a positive, was positive. So that was the only thing I think I can recall, you know, as it relates to that.
That's amazing. Yeah, and Leslie in the chat just brought up the Trans People of Color cookbook as well, which was a super positive story that came out of the 519 even. So that's awesome.
And I just wanted to jump in and pick up on something that Yasmeen said, because I think that that's really important is, you know, journalists tend to talk to institutions, not people. And so I think that I would really encourage people who are listening in on this, because it's quick. And a lot of times the first approach a journalist will make if they want a reaction to a story is to call a place like the 519, is to call someone who organizes a support group. Because that's where a lot of people would start. And I think it's great if someone, you know, who's listening is part of an institution, is on a board of something, or, you know, is a professor, or is somebody who is in a more sort of privileged position. Use your expertise to speak, but I think it's always helpful to then use your own ability to say, you know what, don't just talk to me. Here are 3 folks that I know would be great to talk to the media, or these are people who are emerging activists or change makers who, you know, have not yet had much time talking to the press, to kind of to create sort of a bigger, I mean, I have to say that sometimes journalists have to be pushed because, as Yasmeen says, sometimes we're on a deadline and we need to get to things right away. And so, and especially in the last 2 years of COVID, when a lot of reporting was done by phone, people weren't out on the street just finding somebody at, you know, a coffee shop in the village, say, or, you know, or going to a support group and waiting outside to say, hey, would you mind talking to me? So I think it's really important to be able to, for people within our communities to also be passing, if they can, to say, you should really talk to this person, or here's a perspective I never hear, and it would be great to speak to that person and get out of that. And even, no disrespect to the 519, but again, I'm sure the 519 is constantly barraged with journalists. And I think to be able to spread that out, to get away from the institutions and more to the people.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, sorry, you were going to jump in.
I was just going to say, yeah, like I agree with Rachel.
Yeah, I know the 519 does its best to kind of pass people along and make connections for journalists, especially if we're unable to speak to a particular issue and there's someone out there who is better equipped to do so. Yeah. So thank you, Rachel. That's an excellent point. Maybe I'll throw it back to Yas for a bit. Through your conversations with the TPOC community members about the media guide and kind of two-spirited trans and non-binary representation, what were some good insights or learnings that folks shared with you?
So during the interviews that we had with, you know, creating this guide, a lot of the stuff that came out, one was like equal representation, culturally sensitive to language and historical context around 2SLGBT people, and how for so long how they've been misrepresented or not represented at all. So we really wanted to push some of these pieces. We wanted to show the diversity within our, you know, community, and that again, for so long, TPOC folks has been always seen as marginalized, or apart from all the, you know, violence and trauma and killings that we see of trans women of color a lot in the US and, you know, different countries, and here we wanted to move away from that narrative and really show a lot of positive stories and experiences, that we have and we have to celebrate. And those were some of the pieces that we really wanted to get captured, when we were talking to the journalists, when we were trying to put this guide together, and how to begin the approach when you're approaching TPOC communities versus when you might be approaching another community, and understanding all the levels of trauma and intersectionality and all these different pieces. So those were some of like the nuances and what we wanted to really get across, and I hope that we did.
Yeah. So when a community member wants to talk about their lived experience with either you, Yaz, or with maybe the media, Rachel, in a more formal setting, kind of what are some best practices, or what's your approach when you start those conversations with folks?
First, I want to know, like, what's the reasoning behind it? Like, why do you want to tell this story? Do you understand like the impact this story may or may not have? So are you ready for like both sides? And then start really like, digging deeper. Like, is this story going to be useful? Will it help people? Was it just a story that needed to be told to me, or is it something you just want to talk about? So like all these different, do you understand like the media is not, what you might think it is, especially like maybe for like newcomer folks who may not be quite familiar with, how media works here and all that stuff. So really understanding, like giving them both sides of the coin and letting them then decide, okay, this is something I want to tell. And that once it's in the media, it's probably out there for, forever. So just so that you know that, because I have seen folks tell stories or done media stuff, and later on they're like, oh, I wish this would, go away or disappear. So letting them know like the reality of it for sure, especially now where, nothing good you can find it no matter what. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to maybe chime in, and because I feel like I can explain a little bit of sort of how the sausage gets made on the other end of it, because I think that there's some really good points that got raised. So, one is that a lot of the standard rules and practices of journalism, were set up imagining talking to a set of people who have a good deal of power and agency in the world and see themselves represented all the time. So, one of the rules of journalism is you don't show a subject a rough draft of a story before it gets published. And, so that is something that, so I know oftentimes people will say, I want to be interviewed, but I need to see the story first. And for a lot of reasons, which are sort of, a little bit in the weeds to get into, it's not standard practice to show someone a copy of something before it's published. But I think that there are ways in which a person in the community could say, could you at least maybe chat with me a little bit about what you think you might be using, or is it okay if I come back to you and maybe clarify something, so, that's something that exists in journalism. And the other is, there is a huge conversation happening right now about, what's been called the right to be forgotten. So if you talk to the press when you're 17 years old about something, or there's a story about you that, talks about some aspect of your life, and when it was just print media or, the nightly news on television, that really would disappear in so many ways. But now with the internet, of course, an interview you gave 5 years ago in a Google search will come up, and there might be information in there. So I think Yasmeen is very right to say to people, like, everything lives forever on the internet. And so with that in mind, I think for me, when I'm doing a story about members of our community, my approach is different depending on the level of power a person holds. So if I'm talking to a member of our community who runs an organization, who's a politician, who has a great deal of power, who's talked to the media many times before, I think I would have a different approach than if I were interviewing trans teenager who is unhoused, who doesn't have the same access to power, maybe has not spoken to the media before. So I think that I would probably have a pre-conversation off the record to be transparent about, this is what the process looks like, and this is what the story is going to be about, and this is what it will mean for you to talk to me, and this is what it means to say something is off the record. That tells me that I can't use that. So I would spend more time with somebody who is less versed in talking to the media to talk about what happens when, in that way, I feel like for me, I can both protect the standards that I have to meet as a journalist, but I can practice my trade in a way that feels ethical and transparent, and humane. And so I think that there's not for me one answer about how to tell these stories, because I think it's different depending on which members of our communities are being talked about and talked to, and what the tone of the story is and what it's about. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is I also think it's a really good question. And I was just talking to a friend about this the other day, is I think it's a really important, I believe that journalists who don't belong to a particular community can cover that community, but I would always ask them the question, which is, who are you to tell this story? And by that, I mean, what value can you add to being the storyteller here? How much do you know? Do you want a relationship where you're just parachuting in and parachuting out? Or do you feel accountable to the community that you're covering? How much homework are you going to do? Are you going to talk to one person and, like Yasmeen said, call them up and say, I need to talk to you now, and then you never talk to that person again? Or are you going to establish relationships within communities? And so again, I think that lots of people can cover issues that they don't have an immediate connection to, but I'd want to see the work. I'd want to see, what they've put into practice before they do that kind of coverage. And so I think that's something that I talk to, if I get pitched a story. And when I was at Extra, I would often get pitched stories from people who were straight or cis, and that would always be the question. Sure, but who are you to tell this story? And often they would be the right person to tell the story, or qualified to tell the story, but they need to know in their own mind what expertise they have and what kind of relations they want to build with the community.
Wow, Rachel, those are all such excellent points, and I'm overwhelmed with my follow-up questions now that I want to be asking. I guess my first kind of question is maybe more about the right to be forgotten, and kind of the how journalistic standards and practices are maybe shifting to be more inclusive. I know, as everyone, I hope, many different industries are now examining their practices for inclusivity and diversity, and how we can build stronger and better relationships with communities. So I guess maybe I'll start there. How have some journalistic practices shifted to make these changes?
Yeah, I think part of it is just catching up with that reality, because again, I think a lot of the rules that governed journalism and the idea that you wouldn't unpublish a story happened, before we had really powerful search engines, and also algorithms that, not just powerful search engines, but algorithms that push certain things up. And I also think that we have a community where people are still dealing with real safety issues about being out and open in the world. And in some cases, and I don't say this as a blame, but I think also many of us are still living with a lot of, shame and trauma. And we may share a story in the heat of a moment because we're working through something, and 5 years later realize that we may have put something out in the world and been vulnerable in a way that doesn't reflect who we are now. I would say that most mainstream journalism entities would be very conservative when it comes to unpublishing a story full full stop. But I think one thing that does come up, I think, you know, when these, the sort of a lot of the conversation about the right to be forgotten really started around in, you know, in the Europe, certainly it's a bigger conversation. In the US, there's been a couple of city newspapers that would unpublish stories about small crimes. So if somebody, like where they do a lot of that city reporting about a person who stole a car, that sort of thing. And you'd have a situation where somebody may have stolen a car when they're 18, they're now 30 and they're looking for a job and their employer looks them up and the only mention of them was that, you know, they stole a car or whatever. So there's a lot of questions about how someone's criminal record for nonviolent crimes can follow them and have a real impact on their lives. I also think that there are cases around, you know, certainly around like sexual abuse survivors, where I know publications may opt not to publish a photo or may remove a last name later as a way to offer a bit of protection to somebody who has experienced violence. And certainly, in our case, like even in the Globe and Mail now, if there are real issues around safety, so someone would say, you know, I'm from a place where homosexuality is criminalized. Please don't use my last name, or you use my last name in a story 2 years ago. Would it be possible to remove my last name because I fear for my life? I think those are the cases where a publication would be more open to kind of making those changes. But I just will say, as a word of caution to people, it is very hard to have something unpublished fully. And also, even if a publication unpublishes something, it doesn't ever disappear. You know, what goes on the internet really stays on the internet. And I hope that doesn't stop people from being open, because like Yasmeen said earlier, we need our stories out in the world. But I also think we need to be savvy and cognizant about what it means to have our stories out in the world.
Yasmeen, I want to invite you to maybe share what you think some barriers for journalists and for our communities might be when dealing with the media.
Well, I think the barriers for the journalists is how far they're willing to go and push themselves and be, I don't know if it's an actual barrier, but are they willing to tell the story in the way that we want the story to be told, versus, you know, telling the story, which has always been a challenging thing of finding that balance between, you know, us and them. And sometimes we still end up seeing, you know, glitches and pieces where folks feel, okay, this wasn't accurate or stuff like that. But I think on the side of it for 2SLGBT communities, the barriers are sometimes it's also, like Rachel said, we want to tell the story, but then there's certain parts of our lives that we feel it's too hard, the trauma is too much, or we just feel like, if I tell this now, in 5 years, will I still agree with what I said, or do I want to disclose this information? And that's where I think it comes in. So it's not much like it's more of a challenge than a barrier, that trying to find the balance and trying to say, okay, how do we do this? And then when we do it, how we think this will change people's lives. Because most of the time when they're asking us for the story is to put it out there to be like, okay, now you understand this, now you understand more, or more, you see this more, you understand this issue more affecting, you know, these communities, or this is something they're celebrating versus, so I think that's where the challenge comes in, or the barrier. One of the things also is folks, the media often sometimes don't want to tell the intergenerational story. They want to be very specific to either to youth or to, you know, age demographic, and they feel like we can't tell that story of an older, you know, 2SLGBT person for whatever reason. Maybe they, you know, when they're the ones who probably have the most experience and a lot to talk about. And I think that's one of the things when we're asked, or I'm asked for a story, I'm like, okay, well, this story can be told through maybe a couple people of intergenerational background and history and ages, and that's something too we tend to like fall behind or leave the certain population or group out of the conversation. And that's something too that, more we need to think about more versus a barrier or a challenge.
I think I just want to pick up on that because I think that's such a good point. And I think that, you've pointed out something that I think has been really absent in a lot of the recent coverage around affirming care for trans youth. I feel like there's been a kind of like mainstream media is very excited about this story about talking about trans youth. And obviously because there's real political challenges in places like Texas and lots of places that are cutting off care, and in the UK. And there's, absolute real concern about ensuring that young people have that affirming care. But what's absent, I find, in so many of the stories is the reality of trans people over the age of 20. It's as if the trans community is only, 5-year-olds, who are looking for affirming care. And you rarely hear voices about people who transitioned when they were teenagers or in their 20s and are now, 20, 30, 10 years going on, who actually would be great sources to actually, so when people raise the question of, oh, what about detransitioning, or what about this, or, rarely do you hear the voices of people who perhaps didn't receive affirming care when they were children, who would have a lot to say about the value of affirming care for children and teenagers. So I think that's a really good point about, the way in which certain segments of the community can get focused on context-free, as if they exist without a history, without a broader community, without that it's just, that our community is something that's simple or new, or without ongoing debates or ongoing infighting or ongoing tensions or complex history.
Yeah, I think that those are all really excellent points. I'm wondering how those practices can be incorporated now into kind of teaching younger generations of journalists, how they can maybe be more inclusive and more broad in their thinking when they first approach a story, to include intergenerational perspectives. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I feel very hopeful about, because I've taught journalism, is, the generation of people who are in their, late teens, early 20s, who are joining the profession in every way. Well, and, I mean, I can only speak in the context of being located in Toronto. In every way is much more representative and much more inclusive. They look nothing like legacy newsrooms in terms of their demographics. And they're very complex in their thinking. And they're also a generation of people who have grown up. I mean, for all that the internet and social media can cause problems in our lives, it has also opened up spaces for people to connect and talk to one another. And I think that there's been, as much as our communities face, harassment on those platforms, our communities we found each other on those platforms, and we found a way to communicate and to tell our stories on those platforms. And so I think there's also a younger generation of journalists who are very used to being able to talk about what's going on in the world, whether that's on Twitter or Tumblr or TikTok or, whatever platform is the currency of the time. So I think that there is just less default thinking because kids are in classrooms that, there are more perspectives in them. And I also think, again, to be a little bit hopeful in this, I think that there are projects like this guide which are helpful. There are organizations like the Trans Journalists Association, which I think was founded about a year or two ago, and has done incredible work of, in terms of, training in newsrooms and talking about how trans lives and trans experiences are spoken about in the media. So I think that there's more advocacy within the media itself. And I think from anybody, not just from our own communities, but other communities that don't see themselves as reflected. There are bigger conversations too happening from, say, Black journalists about what does it mean to cover the movement for Black lives and Black Lives Matter, and wanting to feel that they can bring their full selves to that story, but also wanting to talk about what it means to be a person who feels very affected by the news of the day. So what does it mean to be, for Black journalists who are covering the story, say, of the hate crime that just occurred in Buffalo, the mass shooting in Buffalo? What does it mean to be a person telling that story if you yourself feel vulnerable and feel broken by that story? So those conversations are happening. I mean, they tend to be happening with people under the age of 35 than over, but these are all live, very present conversations in the field right now.
Yeah, to your point, I wonder how we can better incorporate best practices for self-care, even as we discuss these kind of stories. Hopefully, as we broaden our coverage that include positive stories, as well as maybe traumatic or kind of violent stories in our communities, how we can weave in best practices to protect ourselves and our communities inside of those conversations. I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, when professional becomes personal and personal becomes professional.
Yeah, it's completely. I know there's many industries, I'm sure, where those practices would be applicable, right? I think we're all kind of trying to find ways to have better boundaries for work and life and how to incorporate those things. Yeah. I kind of want to jump off of that a little bit. Rachel, how has your work at Extra informed your work at the Globe and Mail? And do you find there's a different approach as you move from maybe one publication to another? And maybe if these publications have different reputations for communities, how does that all kind of work together?
Yeah, I mean, when I left Extra to go Globe and Mail, it was quite a culture shock. I went from, an entirely queer, trans, non-binary space to one that was, very hetero, very cis. There is a group of us that have found one another, and I would say at the Globe, and I mean, I went from community-based to big mainstream. I went from small to large. So it was a culture shock on so many levels. I would say that what for me personally is, I felt that I was hired and because I had sightlines that didn't exist. And I feel, and I have decided that I'm going to use those sightlines to bring and to extend those sightlines. So they're not just mine, but that they become part of the whole team. I'm really fortunate in that the group of reporters that I oversee, my job is directing our health, education, and families coverage. So I'm quite fortunate in that the group of reporters that I oversee, for the most part, they're pretty tuned in to issues of, gender identity, sex, sexuality, race, class. So I would say for all of them, the questions, whether it's, we're doing a story right now about people aging and making choices about trying to avoid going into long-term care facilities and looking at alternative models for aging in place. And in talking to the writer, like right out of the gate, it was like, we need to make sure we're hearing from, multiple perspectives. We need to make sure that this is not a story just about, white, wealthy boomers, making their plans. We need to make sure we're hearing from it and that was just that was just an automatic thing in the reporter's mind that they would be reaching out to a broad swath of communities. So I'm really fortunate in that a lot of the people I work with already have that in mind. I think one of the things that can happen and I think it almost happened with me when I started, was I worried a little bit about censoring myself in a different space that I didn't want to. I wanted to think like, how far can I push things? And so one of the first stories I assigned was a story about the mainstreaming of sex toys, because I noticed that Indigo and a bunch of like mainstream places like Urban Outfitters were selling sex toys. And what does that mean? And I was like, is the Globe and Mail going to let me do this story on sex toys? And they did. And I thought the reporter did a great job. And again, spoke to a pretty broad swath of people. And I think that one of the things that I've learned is not to kind of button myself up, and obviously at a place like the Globe and Mail, I can't assume the same degree of knowledge around 2SLGBTQ issues. But I also think I want to get out of the mindset of thinking I know who an audience is, or thinking, I'm writing a story here for like a white straight man in his 40s, and to actually think, no, I'm going to write this story for whoever, or we're going to run a story for whoever I think this story is for, or someone else can keep up if they don't get it, or they can look something up. So I think for me, having worked at Extra, where I felt quite bold to tell certain stories, wanting to bring some of that boldness and ensure that if I was hired because of my sightlines, I wanted to ensure that, like I said at the beginning, that I wanted to ensure that those sightlines were there. And I have to say, I've been very fortunate to feel like I've been told, go for it,
That's awesome. That's really comforting, actually, from a publication like the Globe and Mail, who you might think might not be open to those conversations. I'm going to ask one more question, and then maybe we'll open it up to some folks in the audience who are still around. I'd love to know, kind of, to both Yaz and Rachel, what advice you would offer to kind of journalists who are trying to be inclusive and respectful and accurate in their reporting, but maybe are being challenged in the newsroom by maybe some higher ups.
I mean, you'd have to stand your ground. Journalism is such a, complex job in many ways. So if you are going to tell a story and you believe in the story and you want to tell the story, then you're going to have to, navigate your way through who you need to.
Yeah.
But I feel like that's something more of the past, and I think media and all these resources are open to stories that have been suppressed for a long time and will not be talked about. So I feel like there is room to, unless it's something really, really harmful to someone or a community or something.
Great. Rachel, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think stand your ground. I think when you talked earlier about self-care, I think that's a good point too. So, I think there's always it's always a personal choice for someone who feels like they think it's important to talk about something that they've had an experience of, but feel worried. And I think thinking about, like, if I was going to say, I just want to make sure I'm answering your question correctly. This is about people from our communities talking to the media. Yeah.
Well, journalists in media rooms.
Journalists in media.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say, I don't know that I have much more to add than what I've already said at that point.
Okay, great. Maybe we can open it up to some folks who are still our webinar. So if you're interested in asking a question to Yaz or Rachel, if you could please use the raise your hand icon, and then I'll be able to call on you and you can voice your question aloud. I know there's lots of questions in the chat, so I'm happy to scroll through and voice those questions as well.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll pick a question from Vijay, I see your hand up. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Great, thank you. I did write this in the chat, but I'll just ask. I work in market research, and a lot of clients kind of recognize that they don't understand the nuances of a lot of these kind of equity deserving communities, including the 2SLGBTQIA plus community. So one of the challenges that we run into is kind of getting a broad cross-section of the community, both from a regional perspective and also from just a community affiliation perspective. And I was just curious if either of the panelists kind of have any suggestions on how to kind of best kind of connect with the community and create some sort of meaningful dialogue and ensure that our voices are being heard in like the research that we do, because so often with organizations, the research is what informs their strategy and general communication. And so I think it's just important that they have that at the back of their mind.
I mean, I think, thanks for the question. I think that, you know, I mentioned earlier relationship building, and I think, you know, one of the things that we've kind of talked around, but maybe haven't said as directly is, I think people in our communities, like any, you know, marginalized communities, often it's often an extractive relationship that they have with media or with, you know, and at the same time, I think you're really right in saying we need to be heard from. And so I think it's that, you know, and we, you know, we mentioned the census earlier. And I think that I know that there are folks in the community who had some concerns with the way the questions were phrased. And I appreciate that. And at that same time, like, you kind of don't count unless you're counted. I mean, it's really important to know what our numbers are and what our needs are, as you know, because that is going to be where dollars are allocated, whether that's healthcare, whether that's housing. And so I think it goes back to relationship building. I think it goes back to transparency, to being able to say to people in communities, to give the process longer than you think, to make yourself available to answer questions, to think about different ways to get information from people. You know, there's a practice that's been used a little bit in community journalism called story circles, which is, you know, bringing a small group of people together who may have a, the one example I know of was there was a publication that was doing stories about transit in Toronto, and they wanted to look at transit problems in Scarborough. So they got small groups of people and paid them for their time to come in, and they had a snack to talk about what was it like for them riding the TTC every day. And from there, that gave them a bunch of story ideas, but it was really about building a relationship that empowered the people who the information was being extracted from to feel like they were going to be given time, that it would be a comfortable experience for them. So I don't know that there's sort of one sort of quick fix, but I do think it comes back to you have to build a relationship, and you have to be transparent in explaining why and how this information might be used. And also, why is it of value for this person to talk to you? I think I think to clarify that, and to imagine it might not be quick. It might take a couple of years to build relationships with a particular community. But I think but again, I say this as somebody who believes it's really valuable to have members of our community heard from and counted. I hope that's
thank you. No, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. I have a question from Jamal in the chat. How can 2SLGBTQ plus media outlets work with and share best practices and promising practices for telling 2SLGBTQ stories with legacy or mainstream media?
I think, hey Jamal, nice. It was nice to see your name come up. I think part of it is guides like this that the 519 is putting out, where mainstream organizations are getting direction from communities themselves. I think that is really helpful. I think it's, again, I talked earlier about institutions and people. I think it's great to have institutions that have a degree of power and sway to approach newsrooms, or for newsrooms to approach them and say, we don't just want to hear from the executive director, but could you come in with some people from the community and you know, spend an hour talking to us about what's most important and what's front of mind. You know, and I think too, I think this came up earlier. I think something that Yasmeen had said is that often you'll have journalists who are sort of like, we need to cover this story, and someone from the community will say, yeah, right, that story, but there's like 15 stories over here that you're missing that are really interesting. And so again, I think it comes back to building those relationships, but bringing people from the community into newsrooms so that reporters and editors can develop relationships, again, not just with one person who becomes the spokesperson for all queer and trans people everywhere and all times, but understand that there's many people who can speak in the community. So I also would say it's about also people who are leaders in our community and experts who are super value, also for them sometimes to cede space so that other voices in our communities can come up as the spokespeople or the people that are on the phone with a reporter. I think that would be helpful. I think that would be helpful too. I think you'd be surprised. I think a lot of times stuff happens in journalism, not because there's some grand plan, but because people are super busy and they're looking at what's right in front of them. And journalists want stories, and they want great stories. So if there are people in our communities who want to build those relationships, I think that there's a lot of journalists who would be really happy to hear from members of our community, to hear from the people who can talk about, you know, this is the way that you should be thinking about, you know, the question of dead naming or using correct pronouns, or this is the third time you've called me about something traumatic. I actually want to now talk to you about 5 incredible, inspiring people who are doing great work. And I think that a lot of journalists would be more receptive than you might imagine. So I would encourage people not to think that the complexity of our lives isn't interesting to journalists and isn't important. We might just be busy and we might be lazy.
Thanks so much, Rachel and Yas, for your time today. We're at 1 o'clock. I can't believe that happened so quickly. I want to thank everyone for attending today. I want to thank especially Rachel and Yasmeen for bringing their expertise to this conversation. I learned so much today, and I hope you did too. I want to thank my comms team and Rebecca, who's been our technical support for today. And please, if you have any questions or comments, do not hesitate to reach out. You can find all of our contact information at the519.org. And I really look forward to connecting with all of you. Thanks so much for today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.